And we've got plenty more chairs. So.
There's good issue with it. Did you guys get a chance to come to
Excuse me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. You're getting two, is that right? And you're getting one as well? I thought it was important to note and to bring to light and make sure everybody understands. If you're hearing about something that was discovered, you're hearing about discovering the lost Sand Creek site, I think it's important to know how was it lost to begin with. What was lost and how did it become lost? And then kind of helps to understand how things were found. So I feel like that's a relevant question. How did Sand Creek become lost? And so what we look at the site of Sand Creek. And immediately after, 4 years after Sand Creek, the site was known. It was not lost just 4 years after. There's a man named Lieutenant Bonsall that went out to the site just 4 years after the event, and he went out and measured the distance of the camp. And I actually have a slide here. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see here there's a place where he camped. And going up 6 miles, there's a place called Three Forks. And you can see where there's a place where 3 trails split off 3 different directions. So he measures from this camp 6 miles to Three Forks. And in between here, there's a place on his map that he measures the distance. It's about 2.5 miles, which is the length of the village. So at that point, just 4 years after Sand Creek, there's, it's able to see, like, there's still be remains of like burned teepees and such. So he'd still be able to distinguish what the length of the village would have been just 4 years after. So he went there, and with the Bonsall map, we know of that. It's a strip map. That's all it is. It's just a long strip map that measures distances from one place to another. And so you see that line there, and it's in our book. That map, you can see a good, crystal clear picture of it in our book. So you can see that place where he camped and the line measuring the village. And so you can see, and so that trail, what we know as Bonsall's Trail, is a very important landmark when it comes to Sand Creek. Because from Bonsall's, that trail, that Three Forks, you can measure down and you can know how far the village is from Three Forks. So that's a big distinguishing landmark for knowing where the Sand Creek event took place. But we have to then fast forward a little bit, because a little ways after, so this would have been 1868 when he measured the camp. But we go a little bit further, and there's a map that comes out. It's the 1894 USGS topography map. And when this map came out in 1894, there's no anything marking on that map where Sand Creek was or where Black Kettle's village was. It's not listed on the map. And so now at this point, it's basically becoming lost. And so this map is going to become very important in the course of kind of our program, and in the course of how the monument, where the monument sits at the National Park Service site, where that's an important factor, and how that monument was put where it is. But nearly 30 years after the Bonsall map, that USGS topo map came out, and it does not mark the Sand Creek location. Now fast forward just a little bit further. In 1908, 4 veteran soldiers from Sand Creek decided to hold a reunion. And so 4 soldiers came out on train. They got off the train at Kit Carson, and they went down Sand Creek with an attempt to mark where they fought. And believe it or not, all 4 soldiers had a different location. Not one of the 4 could agree on the spot. So they left in 1908, and when they left, it was left unmarked. They had their reunion, but they did not mark the site when they were here because they could not agree on a spot. But this is interesting because we don't know for sure how far down Sand Creek they went, because again, they got off the train at Kit Carson. But from there, we don't know how far down they went. But on Dad's ranch, either Sand Creek, going through his ranch, we found a spot that appears to be a homesteader's dugout. And there's a place they reached when they were searching for Sand Creek called the Cray Ranch. You may have heard of St. George Cray, or the Cray packing plant that was in Lamar. I don't know if you ever heard of that. That was one of his sons that had that. But anyway, they reached the Cray Ranch, and when they reached it there, they said, "Do you know where the spot where the soldiers attacked and came upon Black Kettle's village?" He said, "Sure, it's just on the other side of these trees." Well, no, they didn't agree. They didn't think that was the spot. And so it was becoming hopelessly lost at this point in the early 1900s. There's a big description that was left about where the village was located, though. And one of those descriptions actually comes from Colonel Shivington. He said that the village was on the south branch of the Big Sandy, or Big Bend of the Sandy. And so what happened when he made this claim about being on the south branch or Big Bend of the Big Sandy is that most people interpreted that to mean that the village was on the bend furthest to the south. So that's a big reason why that the monument was placed where it was. They chose that bend that matched that, they felt matched that description. Another key document that was used for placing that stone marker where it was another map, and that was George Bent's map. And this one's it's kind of faint, hard to see on the screen a little bit, but you can see there's an outline of a creek bend coming down through here, and there's teepees and lodges named for the lodges that were at in Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek. Now again, this is also in our book, and so a lot easier to see in the book than on this screen, but you can get a good view of that by looking in the book. But that bitmap was then used to help show, this is a big major document that was used to say that that bend was the right bend, and they placed the marker there. But what we learned through research and through discovery of artifacts, that when Shivington was talking about the Big South Bend, he was actually referring to something else, and it's a big moment in the book. So I'll leave that there, but it's described, and it makes sense when we come to this realization of what Colonel Shivington meant when he talked about the Big South Bend. And another reason that, I'll go back to that George Bent map, it looks very similar to that USGS topo map, and there's a reason for that. And it's our opinion, and we believe that the reason this map looks so similar to that topo map is that it was traced from the topo map. So by the time that topo map came out, this is before the Bent map came out. So they came out, and it wasn't even Bent himself that drew this map. And so that's important to know too. We learned about that through discovery and research, that Bent himself didn't actually make that map, it was somebody else. But there's a good reason, because that map, it looks like it's just like traced from that topo map. And so again, the topo map doesn't even, it does not have Black Kettle's village. And also this map from Bent does not have a legend. There's no legend on this map, so there's no way to know how far is this 2 miles, 1 mile? There's no marking points of how long anything is. So there's no legend. So that's also problematic with that. So there's some inconsistencies there. So there's another relevant question. So how do we know that that isn't correct? Because what we're told traditionally about Sand Creek is that the Indians, the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, were camped just below a bluff where that monument sits. And that's what we're told, is that they were camped just below that bluff, and then that's where Shivington's soldiers attacked them. But how do we know that this map and this spot isn't right? One of the biggest determining factors through our research and discovery is below that bluff, no artifacts have been found. The only artifacts pertaining to Sand Creek found are starting over 1.5 miles up the creek from there, most of which is actually 2.5 miles starting up the creek from the monument. There's nothing actually to suggest or to substantiate that any Indians were camped below the bluff. There's no physical evidence to support it. And so that's a big factor for us. And actually, this is interesting too, because many skilled archaeologists have searched below that bluff. This isn't like just from our understanding, there's a man named Fred Warner, very successful man with metal detector. he and a team of others went down there several summers in a row, accompanied by a man named Larry Fennell on many trips, was a very successful archaeology with metal detector, and is an extensive amount of artifacts found at the Summit Springs site near Sterling. He had found hundreds of artifacts there. So these are people that are very skilled and experienced, and they came away empty-handed. And here's actually an excerpt. We have a little piece from their book, from Fred Werner's book. They resumed their search the next morning. Werner searched up the creek. I found absolutely nothing except a few junk items, tin cans and wire. The two worked until nearly noon. Neither of us had found a single battle relic. And the interesting thing is this is quoted more than once in his book. And see, they're still following these clues of that bent map and the bend on the bent map. So they're still following that clue. So they're still thinking the artifacts have got to be somewhere below this bluff yet to be found. And they're kind of baffled why they can't find anything, yet they're very experienced. These are not just some fly-by-nighters. These are guys that have found hundreds and hundreds of battle-related artifacts at other sites. And so that's important. And another thing, too, is even after that stone marker was placed in the 1950s, debate swirled about if that was the right spot. It was kind of settled on the right spot, but debate still swirled, and no one really knew for sure if that was right. So how do we come in? How do the Bowens fit into this scenario? I can assure you, we don't have a dog in this fight. The only connection to Sand Creek in the Bowen family is that Dad grew up on that part of Sand Creek. That's the only connection. We don't have any relations or ancestors or anyone that fought at Sand Creek, was at Sand Creek. No connection to the Sand Creek event. That's the only connection, is that Dad grew up on that part of Sand Creek. And so it's important to kind of understand kind of how some of this got lost. We're not trying to retell the Sand Creek story. We're just trying to, share the story, what the artifacts say, and kind of let people read our book, read about the discovery, because first and foremost, this book is a book about discovery, so we want people to read about it and make up their own mind. But they found over 4,000 artifacts on private property, starting over 2.5 miles up the creek. And so kind of how do we come in? So Dad was leasing land from his parents on that part of Sand Creek, and in the early 1990s, he was contacted by another archaeologist who was doing his own research. He was doing his own research, and he came to the conclusion, based on research, that he didn't think that the monument was in the right spot, but was on another bend further up the creek and probably on Bowen land. And so he contacted Dad in the early 1990s, and some other outside groups got involved, and they decided they would do a helicopter flyover over the ranch and some other adjoining ranches. And they were looking for trails and bends and anything they could find from the air that might point them in the direction of another spot that might work if the monument was not, in fact, marking the right place. So these other outside groups got involved. They actually got to fly in a helicopter and fly over the ranch and kind of see the ranch from the air that way. But they are all following the same false trail of clues with the bent map. And so after years of research, this is about 1993, so about 1995, my mom and Dad came to the conclusion, okay, past searches below the bluff have yielded no period artifacts, like the pop cans and things and barbed wire, things like that, thin staples, but nothing related to Sand Creek. So they decided, with past searches yielding no artifacts, that probably meant it's possible that a lot of the action actually took place on Bowen land. So they decided to set out on their own and formulate a plan to find it. They decided they were going to go do their own search and see what they could find. And so you think about this, though. This was an overwhelming project for them, because the ranch that my dad was leasing from his parents, there's 7 miles of Sand Creek going through that ranch. So think about, he's got 7 miles of Sand Creek to search, and he's going to search with a metal detector coil about the size of a dinner plate. So just think, that's a monumental project. That's kind of overwhelming. And so they decided to form a team. And so Mom was the researcher and Dad was the archaeologist. And this time of setting out to search for this goes back to when I was in high school. I remember coming home from school every single day, and Mom would be reading an eyewitness account out loud, and Dad would be taking notes. Because what they decided was that the only thing that they knew they could trust was going to have to be eyewitness accounts, people that were at Sand Creek, because they needed descriptions of the land. They needed to know where to go search. They needed specific descriptions. So they would read eyewitness accounts. They would learn about things like, at such a spot there were, banks 200 yards wide, and other spots that only fit areas on their ranch. And so when they're reading these accounts, my dad is just, the light bulbs going off all the time thinking, I know where these spots are. It helps narrow it down, but it's still a lot of land to search. That's still a big project. So again, that's the only connection, is growing up on that part of Sand Creek. And so they would read from eyewitness accounts only. And the other thing too that's really sobering to me with all this, he didn't have a team of people that went out with him. I went out sometimes. He had his good friend Joe Harbert that went out many times. He's here today. He's going to come up here in a little bit, and he's going to share about some of the things he helped find. But he didn't have a team of like 20 that would go out and help him dig. It'd be like maybe 2, maybe 3 max at a time. Most of the time him or him with Joe, and that's it. So he didn't have a team of people. And so he found all of this on his own, over 4,000 pieces. And every single piece was about 2 to 3 inches deep, and every single piece was an individual dig. So it was a monumental project and discovery. So every day he would go out, he would feed cattle, and he'd come back with artifacts. He would come out with another handful of artifacts every day, whether it be bullets or buttons or spurs or you name it, kettle fragments, arrowheads. The list goes on and on. He would come out and back every day finding more and more. And so 1995, though, is when they started their search. And it was really slow going at first. Those first couple years, they really didn't find a lot. And it was almost kind of a frustrating experience. But by 1997, 2 years after starting, it just started clicking. And he just started finding piece after piece after piece. And it was really never ending. He just kept finding more and more. And it was just amazing. And the other thing, too, with everything that he found, he would take a photo of it and get the GPS coordinate. So this isn't some, hokey, throw it in a bag and, put it in a case later. We've got maps on his computer, and we've got maps that show with GPS coordinates all the artifacts that were found. A lot of these pictures of our maps are in our book. So we wanted to share that with people so they knew kind of where the extent of where these things happen. We've got over 100 photos of artifacts in the book, and maps, and other period documents, and things showing where things happened and how things came to be. And another thing, too, getting into the later 90s, and now the National Park Service gets involved because they're looking to, to put out a historic site. And so they get involved. So my mom and dad meet with the NPS personnel, and they let them know about their discovery and what they found. And some promises were made for recognition of discovery. So you'll have to read in the book kind of what those promises of discovery were, and who made them, and if they were kept. That's all in our book. Another thing we learned through research is that there's a lot of books written about Sand Creek, but a lot of books, interestingly, don't cite eyewitnesses. Sometimes they don't cite witnesses at all, or any source. And so we found that to be very, very interesting. So there's one way we can know if a book about Sand Creek is talking about things correctly. They'll talk about whether the event, how things and where they took place, because we can substantiate that with where artifacts were found. That's the interesting thing. There's over 4,000 pieces of physical evidence. And if you were to think about this in a courtroom, if there is a court proceeding on something, what's more important, physical evidence or hearsay evidence? It's obviously physical evidence. And so he's got over 4,000 pieces of physical evidence. And so that's one way we can know if a book about Sand Creek is being honest, is how they talk about the event and where things took place. And there's one book that a lot of people actually claim, they talk about it being like the Bible of Sand Creek, and it's a book called The Sand Creek Massacre, and I believe his last name is pronounced Hoig, H-O-I-G, He's the author of this book. And for many years, this is the book Dad referred to. Because without, having anything else presented beside it, there's no way to know the information in there isn't, there is information in there that isn't correct. So one way we can know, again, is by artifacts. But at the beginning of his book, it's interesting. He talks about how the information that he uses comes from testimonies and other accounts. And so testimonies would be like, after Sand Creek, there were 3 hearings held, and a lot of people testified after Sand Creek. And in fact, that's another point, but a lot of people that testified were not at Sand Creek. That's another thing we'll talk about a little bit more. But he has this book, and he says this information comes from testimonies and other accounts. What we learned is he actually summarizes a lot of these accounts in his own words. For example, on page 146 in his book, he talks about Sand Creek as a river. Well, if anybody has any familiarity with Sand Creek, it's definitely not a river. And in fact, by its name, Sand Creek, it's a dry creek. It rarely has running water at all. And according to George Bent, that's even what the Indians called it. They called it Dry Creek because it rarely had running water. So I found that to be really, really interesting. And so I'm going to have an excerpt there in just a second. So he talks about a quote here, and I'll read that here in a second. But he routinely cites people that were not at Sand Creek, which is interesting. He'll use sources like Major Wynkoop. He uses him a lot. He once commanded at Fort Lyon prior to Sand Creek. And he also quotes a lot from a historian named George Grinnell, but he was not at Sand Creek. But I think it's important when studying these events, we look at people who were there. And under testimony, this is interesting, and we have this in our book too. Wynkoop testified. He was asked about the number of Indians encamped at Sand Creek. He says, "I could not positively state the number except from hearsay." So he was not at Sand Creek, yet Hoig, the author of this book, thought he was a credible source of information. So a lot of people call it the Bible of Sand Creek, but it's not based on actual testimony. And so I found that to be really interesting because the only piece of concrete evidence is physical evidence. Secondhand information like hearsay is very, very hard to verify. And a lot of times that's the intent. If you follow, sometimes political proceedings or whatever that might be. Sometimes it's just the matter of the damage being done, and it's not about whether it was accurate to begin with. And another thing, when you look at with information with Sand Creek, it's been passed down by generation to generation. And when information changes hands, information changes. And so that's really important. So using eyewitness accounts was about the only way we could do that. One thing, though, that does not lie are artifacts. And it's important to note, too, the artifacts that he found, starting about 2.5 miles up the creek from the monument, it's important to understand the creek runs in the other direction. So there's no way, artifacts, were pushed that way with water or anything else. In fact, if anything, they would have been pushed towards the NPS site. But again, they're all found about 2 to 3 inches deep in the ground. So, this is really interesting. Hoig, in his book, he also talks about there was and this is traditionally told with the Sand Creek story, the soldier, Captain Silas Sewell. And we're told through this traditional story that he refused to fight at Sand Creek. But remember, Hoig said his information came from testimony. And this is Sewell's actual testimony also in our book. Major Anthony ordered my company, which was directly in line of fire of the battery, to move down into the creek. Before I got into the creek, there were troops upon both sides firing across. It was unsafe for me to take my command up the creek. Okay, I didn't see anything in that testimony about him refusing to fight. That's interesting because he talked about the concern for crossfire. That's a very different concern than refusing to fight. Very different. And so it's just interesting what we hear through the traditional story. Again, when information changes hands, information changes. And with this was his actual testimony, which is written. So we can always go back to that. Another thing, Hoyt does not make any mention of Little Bear in his account of Sand Creek. So the Little Bear account is very important. Where do we find his account? Is actually in George Bent's letters. So all of you from probably the Lahana area are very familiar with Bent's Fort. And so the original Bent's Fort was built by William Bent, George's dad. George was born there in 1843. And this is important because from his letters is he lived as a Cheyenne warrior. And so he wrote to historians years after Sand Creek about his experience living as a Cheyenne warrior and living in Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek. So he was there, and he writes all about his experience. And the Little Bear gives an account how early in the morning he got up to go across and got up on a high hill to go get his pony. And he looked south towards the Lodgepole Trail. And he could see way off in the distance, he could see the soldiers as a long black line. That was his direct quote. And so we're not told this in the traditional story. We're told that the soldiers came upon them in this sleeping village below a bluff and they were attacked. But according to George Bent, who was actually with the Indians, he says that's not the case. That they actually saw the soldiers miles away. If you're to see something as a long black line, that's a long way off. That's a long way. So they had seen the soldiers coming, and this is completely left out of this book. And there's a quote here. It's out of the Rocky Mountain News. I'll just read it straight from the book. The affair at Fort Lyon, Colorado, in which Colonel Shivington destroyed a large Indian village and all its inhabitants, is to be made the subject of congressional investigation. Now, this is stating that they killed all the inhabitants. Now, this is where there's a lot of information about Sand Creek that goes on that's very inconsistent. And that one of those is the amount of Indians that were killed at Sand Creek. Now, the official count was reported to Major Scott Anthony, who was actually at the time the commanding officer at Fort Lyon. And he was reported to that the number of Indians killed was 69. That was the official count to him. Now, it's interesting because other numbers would range around 100 plus. George Bent had it about 137 and 163 in two different letters. And now today the National Park Service has it a little over 260, which is interesting because there's no way to know where these new numbers come from. Is it just reported as if it's always been that number? And so it's very interesting because in 1889, George Bent wrote a letter to a historian, Sam Tappan. That's another important figure when it comes to Sand Creek. He said that there was about 130 killed. And in a letter to historian George Hyde in 1913, he said about 167. And he said about 110 were women and children. But he did not break that number down. He also did not break down how many of those killed were non-combatants. Because it is important to know sometimes women were combatants. And also George Bent said in another letter that soldiers could not tell the difference between a male and a female Indian from firing distance. So this is very interesting. This is all coming from George Bent, who was living as a Cheyenne warrior. So I found that to be very interesting and a very credible piece of information. And so, and even if, I don't know how it could go from 69 to 260 plus, but even if that were the case, it'd still mean about half the village escaped. Because it's estimated through many soldiers' testimony that there was roughly about 100 lodges, maybe a little more, and about 4 to 5 Indians per lodge. So it'd be upwards of about 500 Indians in the entire village. So it was a fairly large village, but we're not exactly sure, but it's going to be close to 500. And so the only written history we have on that Indian side was from George Bent. And he wrote his letters to historians about his Cheyenne life and time at Sand Creek. And we have many letters from George Bent cited in our book, and we have them with the citation right there in the text of what letter that was, what year and date that was to each historian. So we cite it directly to him. So we bring that straight from his letters. And so interestingly, as we talked about a minute ago, George Bent was born in 1843 at Bent's Old Fort. Now, during his school years, he was actually sent to Missouri. He did some of the school years around Kansas City and St. Louis. But after he completed his school years and completed his education, the Civil War was going on. So George Bent decided to enlist in the Civil War. Well, Missouri was a border state. And so George Bent could decide whether he fought as a Confederate or Union. Well, the Bent family, the Bent family in Missouri, William Bent's parents, would be George's grandparents, were actually slave owners in Missouri. So he actually chose to fight as a Confederate, and likely because his family in Missouri owned slaves. And so he chose the fight as a Confederate. And after his time in the Civil War, he fought in 4 Civil War battles. And he was actually captured in one and released and then sent back to Colorado Territory. Upon his release and return to Colorado Territory, at first he went back to his father's ranch, but then he decided to go join the life as a Cheyenne dog soldier. And so he lived with the Indians, and in fact, George was half Cheyenne. And so he chose the Cheyenne life after his time in the Civil War. And he was there with Black Kettle at Sand Creek. And he wrote extensively about his time as a Cheyenne warrior. And he would talk about in letters, he would go on wagon train raids, and that they would kill white settlers, and that would include young children and taking white captives. And this is all in the summer of 1864, several months before Sand Creek. So I find that to be interesting, that this was happening in the summer before Sand Creek. It's a lot of the kind of information we don't hear a lot with Sand Creek. But he says that day of Sand Creek, this is interesting too, is he talks about how during the engagement at Sand Creek, that he and a bunch of other Indians ran 2.5 miles up the creek to rifle pits. Now, we're going to keep that thought earlier. We talked about how Little Bear saw the soldiers as a long black line. And we're going to try to remember, too, that traditionally we're told that the Indians were camped just below the bluff, and they had no warning of the soldiers' attack. But here's George Bent saying that they ran 2.5 miles to rifle pits. I don't think that's possible if they were right below that bluff and didn't see the soldiers coming. There's no way they're going to outrun 700 cavalry soldiers on horseback for 2.5 miles. It just does not make sense to me. And so remember, though, too, Little Bear's account said they saw the soldiers as a long black line way off in the distance. They had a head start. They fled. They fled. And in fact, when you look at maps of artifacts and where artifacts were found, there's a lot of village artifacts. My dad found multiple teepee site locations. One of the more sobering and somber things that he found was actually the rifle, well, not the rifle pits, but the fire pits. You could dig down and fill into it, and it felt like ash, like talcum powder. And he found many, many places like this, and you knew. It's just kind of a chilling moment to find something like that, because that's the last time that burned was probably November 28, 1864, the night before, the day before. So it's a sobering thing to find things like that. But he found many, many village artifacts and village teepee sites. But in that village, he didn't really find very much battle-related artifacts. Those are all further up the creek. And so again, how we say we can know if a book or something about Sand Creek is honest, we know from the artifacts, because they can't lie. And so he said that they ran 2.5 miles. And we're not sure, did George Bent mean they ran on foot 2.5 miles? Or were they on a horse? Because a lot of times, he also said in his letters, they often kept their horse tethered to next to their teepee. So a lot of them would have a horse right there. So it's possible, and he said they ran 2.5 miles. They got on a horse and went 2.5 miles up the creek to these rifle pits. Now, he also said that when they got to these 2.5 miles, that they dug these rifle pits in the sand, that the women and children dug these rifle pits. This is also another hard one, because I want to think about this for a minute. Because if they are running 2.5 miles and digging these pits, he said one pit was big enough to hold 19 or 20 people. That, to me, sounds like these were dug before Sand Creek. And that is a discrepancy and inconsistency with some of the reports. Some of the soldiers that were there, they thought they were dug before. A lot of them did. Some weren't sure. But it's important to note that just logic and common sense, it would make sense that they were dug before, and I'll get to that here in just a second. Because when he says they ran 2.5 miles, it's important to note, in George Bent's letters, he sometimes uses the wrong word or not a strong enough word. Like one time he was talking about the dog soldiers, and he said that the dog soldiers caused mischief in towns. Well, mischief, that kind of sounds to me like Dennis the Menace. They might run through and turn over and, let their horses loose or something. But in reality, though, he sometimes used a not strong enough word, because in another letter, he said that tornadoes cause mischief. I don't think any of us need an explanation on what tornadoes do. They don't cause mischief. They cause complete destruction. I mean, think about what a tornado does. We know what they do. And another thing we know about, especially through George Bent's letters, is we learned that the Indians actually like to fight during the spring and summer, not during the winter. They wouldn't have been as prepared in the winter. They like to fight in the spring and summer. So it's our belief, again, this is our belief based on George Bent's letters and his description of events, that the Indians were actually preparing to move their camp up the creek about 2.5 miles and have a spot in these rifle pits where they could lure the soldiers into and fight. Because this is why I believe that. During his time in the Civil War, George Bent would have learned about the use of rifle pits, similar to the trench warfare that we hear about in even the First World War. We hear about trench warfare. They used rifle pits in the Civil War. George Bent was very familiar with them. And in his time, he was only at Sand Creek for 3 days, but we believe that during those days prior to Sand Creek, they were digging these pits and getting ready for a springtime fight. But again, that's an opinion, and we believe but Dad has actually found these rifle pits based on digging tools and other things that he found there that you'll read about more in our book. So he learned about these things in the Civil War. And so we learn about eyewitness accounts such as George Bent and the location of artifacts. Because what we're told traditionally, again, is that it was right below that bluff. But this did not happen in an isolated area. The artifacts just don't support that. They were found starting 2.5 miles up the creek, going up for several miles, and in multiple spots. Indians were scattering. They were fleeing and fleeing in multiple different directions. And so we have to look at that story the artifacts tell, because they cannot lie. And the artifacts and eyewitness accounts tell us otherwise. And again, Dad found digging tools just about 2.5 miles up the creek from the top of the village, just as George Bent said. And so also another part of that Sand Creek story that we hear about is that there were no warriors in the camp at Sand Creek. But George Bent himself was a warrior. And he wrote about other warriors that were there. So we know warriors were in fact in camp and not off hunting, just simply from his account. And another thing too is we're very also transparent with the Sand Creek story. There's not a broad brush or a blanket statement that we can make concerning Sand Creek, because we don't shy away from, there were some soldiers that did bad things at Sand Creek, and we do not shy away from that. But there's not a broad brush, because not all soldiers did. And so that I think is important to know, because also during the engagement at Sand Creek, there was a soldier killed in a gruesome way. He was actually killed by a warrior, and he had his gun jammed into his chest. That's hard for that to happen if it's just the soldiers running through this village of sleeping Indians below the bluff. That couldn't have happened. So there's a lot of layers to Sand Creek. There's a lot of layers. We just can't paint it with a broad brush. And this is important. This is really neat, because during the time in research and time of discovery, my mom and dad met some really neat people. And have you ever just had a moment in your life that could only have been really just orchestrated by God, or something kind of just coming together, that there's no other reasonable explanation? It was just kind of just brought together for a purpose and a reason. Well, Mom and Dad were needing to get their chimney cleaned. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and read this out of our book. It became more of a tradition than practicality that we burned cottonwood in our fireplace that I cut on Sand Creek. We were not only providing additional heat for our home, but the smell of the smoke was reminiscent of a long time ago. We decided it was time to clean the chimney and found only one listing, B&M Chimney Sweep, 70 miles west. Bob explained he usually doesn't go as far as Lamar. It's just too costly. He said he did have a job only 36 miles from us, so if we didn't mind waiting, he could do both jobs that day. Bob Spade arrived wearing the traditional outfit of a chimney sweep, a top hat and a black coat with long tails. I like your 1860s attire. Reminds me of the era of the Sand Creek battle in 1864. Have you heard of it? I said. Not only have I heard of it, my great-grandfather, Arthur Gibson, was a soldier, Bob said. Sherry and I recently discovered the lost Sand Creek site on my parents' ranch. We both recognized this divine appointment. It would be a while before the chimney would get cleaned. There was a lot to learn about his great-grandfather. And his great-grandfather was Arthur Gibson. And you can learn a lot more about him in our book, but he came to clean the chimney, and they had no idea about him beforehand, but turns out he was very familiar with Sand Creek, and his great-grandfather fought there, so they became very acquainted. Dad took Bob out to Sand Creek. That's Bob there on our screen. Took Bob out to Sand Creek and showed him around. And then this is a group, and Bob and Mary stayed. You can see Bob's right there, and Mary's right there, and they're right behind this gentleman with his head down. You can't see his face, but that was a man named Ed Bars. And Ed Bars was a nationally recognized historian. It was, in fact, historian emeritus with the National Park Service for many, many years. And he's known for his research on the Civil War era. Many times he was shown on the History Channel, and he came out, he was a lead historian on a tour that came to visit my parents' Sand Creek tours in the early 2000s. And so Ed Bars is there with Bob and Mary, and they went and toured around their lost Sand Creek site. And again, most of the time when Dad went out there, he went out by himself, but a lot of times he was accompanied by Joe. And Joe helped find a really neat piece. So I'm actually, and then I'm going to have him come up in just a second. Almost forgot this gun here. Bob used to carry and have this gun. That was the gun his great-grandfather had at Sand Creek. And so he had that, and we were able to see that gun when he had it. And then that's the soldier, that's Arthur Gibson. And then again, we learned a lot, and they got very acquainted with Bob and Mary. And so we're going to ask Joe to come and share a couple minutes about a really cool find. I think you'll enjoy hearing this story from Joe.
Joe Harvard, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Hang on. Little. Okay, is that okay? Okay, I've been going with Chuck. Come on, thank you. I've been going with Chuck metal detecting about 20 plus years. And I personally have found quite a few things I love because Michael went over everything that we find. Chuck takes a picture of it and he GPSes it, he plots it. So it's, I don't know how people can argue when they say the battle was at one spot when in reality we find so many things. This is the book, this is me. Chapter 10 is me. You need to get it. Okay, here. Okay, I got a couple stories. I'll make it quick. The first time Chuck and I went out, it was a nice hot day, and we're looking for rattlesnakes, which we find every now and then. And at this place, we just didn't find much. And we walked together. We're tired. We're sweating. And there's a little cow trail, and if you know about cows, the only thing I know about, like hamburger for me, but anyway, they had a little cow trail, and they walk on that thing. And we put our metal detectors down, and Chuck's went off. And we were, come here, girl, come here. Okay, we're standing, we're about like this right here, and our metal detectors are here. Nice job. Thank you. And I thought, oh my, what's this? So I dig it up, it's yay deep. And as always, Chuck knows what everything is. And this thing was the size of a quarter, and it was a metal star. And immediately Chuck says, "Star tobacco." What? What are you talking about? Well, way back when, well, recently, guys, they have their chew in their back pocket, right? That little round circle back here. Well, my understanding, this was a cake of tobacco. It was wrapped up, and the symbol of it was the star, and they called it star tobacco. And I thought, how bizarre, we're out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and we come up with that. And the second and last story I got, we're leaving Lamar, we're going out there, and on Chuck's dash is this heavy, well, this is it right here, this heavy little thing right here. What on earth is this thing? It weighs a lot. Just kidding. And he proceeded to tell me this is the actual cannonball itself. He proceeded to tell me there's a fuse in it, and they turn it and they put it in a cannon and they shoot that puppy out there, and it will roll on the ground, it will explode, it'll explode 5 feet in the air, 10 feet in the air, depending on the arc and then depending on a lot of things. And I was just mesmerized by this. Inside the cannonball is what I call a bunch of little steelies, and I'm sure they just put anything that would violate somebody. But this amazed me. So we get out to Sand Creek and we parked the pickup on the road like we always did. And about 100 yards from where we were, Chuck said, "See that stake out there? See that green stake?" And I said, "Yeah, stake, not snake." And anyway, he said, that's where I found this thing. And I thought, oh man, I was amazed. So as a rule, when we metal detect, we start in an area, we put some flags, and we go straight, flag it, and then we scoot over, and then we come back, and then we scoot over and go back. So we just don't randomly go, we try to work in lines. So I'm metal detecting, my machine goes off, I dig down, and for once in my life, I knew what I got. Thanks for smiling. And it comes up, I found this puppy. This is the same thing that Chuck had. And I'm looking around, Chuck's doing his thing, and it was at least a football field away from where Chuck found his. So I call Chuck, I got something. So he comes over, he takes a picture of it, he GPS's it, he puts it in a little, I call it a nail belt he carries, and off we went. We're coming back home, we're in the pickup, we're tired, we're hot. Chuck, where's that piece I found? He gives it to me. I get the one on the dash, and I'm fooling around with it, and they fit, they match. These are the actual ones. I was amazed. I told Chuck, he almost wrecked the truck. I made that up, he didn't do that. But I thought, oh my gosh, it's amazing. And just these two pieces alone, if you get a chance, pick them up, they're heavy. And if this hits someone, oh my, just, it was a brutal time in history. But it's a brutal time now. But it is what it is. Thank you for listening. Remember, chapter 10.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. I always love hearing that story, and I've heard it many times. It's one of my favorite ones. I thought I would go ahead and close out with an excerpt from the book that I think you guys will really enjoy. Butch Kelly visited a month later to look at bullets and other artifacts I found. Butch is a local historian and an Indian Wars cavalry reenactor. He portrayed a soldier in Son of the Morning Star, a TV miniseries about George Custer in events prior to the Little Bighorn. He looked at a cavalry carbine swivel from a carbine belt, some spurs, a bit, and 3 or 4 things that could be identified as military, he said. "Is there anything else?" Butch said after looking at hundreds of artifacts. Wasn't this enough? What more could he want? I had some 5-gallon buckets full of things like barbed wire, fence staples, round nails, and even a hubcap from a Model T Ford. Well, there was the piece of cast iron on the dash of my pickup. It didn't seem worth mentioning. I thought about putting it in my bucket of junk, but I didn't know for sure what it was. So there it stayed, and it sometimes bounced awkwardly, hitting the windshield. I went to get it. There were some threads in it that could have had something like a pipe screwed in it. I handed it to him, thinking it was worthless. Do you know what this is? I had to admit that I didn't. I thought it could be a broken piece of a windmill weight. The old windmills had counterbalance weights instead of tails that are common on them today. Some of the early weights were ornamental and looked like barnyard animals like horses, pigs, or cows. Some were just simple round balls. Perhaps the threads were where it screwed into the windmill. I'll tell you what this is. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. I was not prepared for what he would say next. I'm going to stop right there. And the rest of it is in the book. So I'm going to stop right there. And we hope that you will get a copy of our book if you haven't already. Stop and look at some of the artifacts. We have a few things on the table, like there's a water barrel hoop sitting over there. Check it out. That's what Indians would make arrowheads from those. So take a look at that. Take a look at those pieces that Joe showed us just a minute ago. Take a look at all the artifacts. Come get a book. And I believe somebody left $25 in cash for a book. So if that was you, please come see us so we can get your book for you. If you already paid for it, let us know, because we have $25 for somebody on our table. So come let us know, and come stop by and get a book, get it signed. It's no extra cost to get the book signed. Thank you again, everybody, for coming today. What a great crowd. We're very thankful.
Flowers and gifts.